Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into the swirling haze of spice-scented history. You're standing barefoot on ancient stone, the air heavy with cardamom and rosewater. To your left, a vendor grinds nutmeg with a stone mortar the size of your head. To your right, a boy fans glowing coals beneath a copper pot of simmering cumin stew. It's late. Lanterns swing from silk ropes casting honey-colored shadows, and the spice market murmurs like it's alive. You're not just shopping. You're traveling, drifting through centuries and sandstorms through mountains and port cities, in pursuit of something as small as a peppercorn and as powerful as a king's ransom. Oh, and heads up, you probably won't survive this journey. Between the dysentery, camel drama, and occasional Mongol invasion, the mortality rate isn't exactly relaxing. But hey, what's historical tourism without a little danger? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're tuning in from somewhere far away, drop your location and local time below. I love seeing where you're all dozing off from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step deeper into the market, brushing past bundles of dried turmeric and pyramids of star anise. This isn't some modern spice rack. This is the lifeblood of ancient trade, the stuff empires lived and died for. Spices weren't just flavor. They were ceremony, medicine, status, even prophecy, depending on who you asked. A merchant with a beard like braided wool beckons you toward his stall. He's selling true cinnamon, shaved into delicate curls from Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka. You reach out, and the scent is startling. Sweet, yes, but also smoky, warm and a little like the inside of an old wooden box that used to hold secrets. He offers you a taste. You nibble the edge. It zings across your tongue and settles somewhere behind your eyes. Now here's the kicker. The cinnamon you're tasting might have taken years to get here. Before it landed in this market, it grew wild in a coastal grove, was stripped and sun-dried by hand, packed into jars, smuggled past pirates, braved monsoons, and swapped hands. At least 8 times. And all that for pie topping. The earliest written records of cinnamon pop up on Egyptian medical scrolls dating back to around 1500 BCE. That's right, your nighttime chai blend has been knocking around for over 3,000 years. But historians still argue whether the cinnamon the Egyptians used was the real deal or a totally different bark with a fancy name. Even back then, spice fraud was a thing. As you drift past another stall, a child is stirring a vat of dye made from turmeric and crushed flowers. Spices weren't just for eating, you know. They colored robes, anointed statues, and stained royal scrolls. You dip your finger in the dye and swirl it on your palm. The warmth is instant, earthy. A bell rings. It's not time, it's temperature. Vendors use bells to signal the cooling of clay ovens. Clever, right? You hear snippets of languages, Persian, Arabic, Greek, something that might be early Swahili. This isn't just a market, it's a meeting point of worlds. Each trader carries not just goods, but ghost stories, rumors, and recipes that change, slightly with each telling. One woman claims nutmeg wards off the plague, another insists it cures broken hearts, someone else just wants it for soup. You move past a man selling dried rose petals and crushed myrrh, used in perfumes and prayers. Beside him, an older woman is spooning out dried coriander and muttering a lullaby under her breath. You can't help but notice how small everything is. These goods sparked wars, built cities, and still, they're all tiny. A handful of cloves, a palmful of cumin, a pouch of mace. There's something oddly comforting about how the grand, grinding machinery of history hinges on something so delicate. You pause near a fountain where someone's brewing chai from scratch. The steam curls around your face, heavy with clove and cardamom. It's oddly familiar, and yet you're nowhere near your kitchen. Then a young boy pushes a cart past, and you catch the scent of something weird. Is that dried galangal? You're not sure, but it smells like pine trees, and Pepper had a baby. He's heading toward a trader's circle where the older merchants are debating spice weights with the intensity of stockbrokers. You lean in, trying to understand their hand signals, part barter, part ballet. Someone offers you a tiny woven pouch. Inside is long pepper, an ancient relative of the black pepper you know. It looks like a pine cone's baby sibling and tastes like pepper, yes, but also something wilder, almost lemony. Fun fact, The Romans were obsessed with this stuff before black pepper took over their menus. Which reminds you, not all spice stories end well. Remember that Roman cookbook where everything's drenched in fish sauce and pepper? Yeah. Let's just say their food trends haven't aged perfectly. Still, in this quiet corner of the night, wrapped in smells older than your ancestors, you feel something settle. You're a part of it now. The grand, messy, fragrant history of spice. And you've only just begun. You follow the scent of something sharper now. Spicy, clean, and almost citrusy. The breeze carries it from a nearby stall, where a vendor is cracking open a burlap sack filled with tiny, shriveled black berries. Peppercorns. Not just any kind. Piper. Nigrum black pepper. The kind that built fortunes and toppled trade alliances. You reach in, scoop a few into your palm, and roll them around. Hard, light, and a little oily to the touch. It's strange how something so humble could be worth its weight in gold at one point. But that's pepper for you. The Beyoncé of spices, universally adored, frequently overused, and surprisingly feisty when fresh. This batch, the vendor tells you, comes from the Malabar coast, way down in what is now Kerala, India. That coast was the stuff of legend for Roman merchants. They called it Melische, the pepper coast, and it might as well have glowed on their maps. The Roman appetite for pepper was nothing short of gluttonous. You've got emperors spicing their wine with it, stuffing it in roast boar, and allegedly even burning it as incense. Because what's more luxurious than smoking dinner seasoning? But here's where it gets delightfully messy. Historians still argue whether the Romans actually knew where their pepper came from. Sure, they traded with Indian merchants, but did they picture the swaying palms of Kerala? Or just imagine pepper sprouting fully formed in amphorae? You walk alongside a camel caravan now, dozens of animals lumbering under crates packed with pepper, sesame, and dried ginger. The bells on their harnesses jingle like lazy wind chimes, and the camels smell, well, they smell like a combination of sun-warmed rug and regret. But they're vital. Camels are the semi-trucks of the ancient world, and without them, pepper doesn't travel. As you journey with them, you hear stories whispered by the traders. One insists that pepper cures snakebite. Another claims it staves off madness. A third says it once stopped an entire war when a sultan offered a barrel of the stuff in exchange for peace. You're skeptical, but he swears it's true. He read it in a scroll once. The desert shifts beneath your feet. Sand dunes rise and fall like golden waves, and the pepper sacks creak on camelbacks with each sway. You snack on a bit of flatbread rubbed with olive oil and black pepper, and it stings your tongue just enough to wake you up. As night falls, the caravan stops. A fire is built, and everyone settles in with bowls of lentils and rice laced with, you guessed it, pepper. You're halfway through your meal when a trader across the fire pulls out a worn Roman coin. He claims it was found in southern India, proof of ancient contact. And he's not wrong. Real coins from the Roman Empire have been found in Indian coastal sites like Arikamidu. Historians believe it was part of a robust maritime trade that shipped pepper across the Arabian Sea and up the Red Sea to ports in Egypt. From there it traveled overland, or sometimes directly up the Nile, and ended up in the marketplaces of Rome. Imagine the pepper you just tasted crossing that entire route. It would have touched at least 4 different empires, ridden 2 camels, 1 ship, and probably been taxed half to death. Still, demand never dropped. Roman chefs craved pepper like it was powdered magic. But there was also fear. Some people believed spices, especially pepper, were a bit too exotic. Roman satirist Juvenal once mocked the upper class for throwing spices on everything from turnips to funerals. There was this idea that luxury weakened the soul, and nothing said soft and spoiled like peppered eels on silver platters. Still, even moralists kept eating it. No one really gives up flavor in the name of principle. As the stars sharpen above you and the desert quiets, someone begins playing a flute. The music is thin and reedy, like a spice itself, just a dash, but it transforms the air. You lie back, on a woolen mat, your belly warm, your hands still smelling faintly of crushed pepper. The fire crackles low and the pepper merchant starts telling a story. He swears it's true, though he says it with the grin of someone who knows it probably isn't. He says pepper was a gift from the god of storms dropped into the sea during a tantrum. It washed up on the Indian coast and started growing like wildfire. That's why it's spicy, he says. It carries the god's anger in every seed. You don't believe him, obviously. But still, you notice the wind picks up just a little after. He finishes. And then the oldest trader, quiet until now, leans in and mutters that the best pepper isn't even grown anymore. He claims it came from vines that only flowered once every 40 years, guarded by a sect of monks who aged it in clay jars and blessed each batch with a prayer. He's probably making that up too. Probably. Still, in the hush of the desert night, surrounded by sacks of one of the most coveted spices in history, the story doesn't seem that far-fetched. And tomorrow you follow the spice trail northward, chasing a saffron sunrise. You wake up to the sound of camels snorting and traders arguing over tea. Morning on the spice road doesn't exactly come with a snooze button. The desert air is brisk and dry, and someone's already boiling water in a battered copper kettle. That looks older than time. You stretch, brush sand from your face, and breathe in the scent of cumin and wood smoke. It's breakfast. Lentils again, but this time with dried mint and a generous pinch of coriander seed. Coriander's a quiet spice, often underestimated. It doesn't have the fiery personality of chili or the perfume of cardamom, but it holds its own. Crush a few seeds in your hand. They smell like lemon and toasted paper. Fresh, bright, but earthy. A trader sits beside you, handing over a piece of flatbread. He says coriander is an ancient favorite, used by the Babylonians, Egyptians, and even tucked into Tutankhamun's tomb. No kidding. Archaeologists actually found coriander seeds among the grave goods, like the boy king might need seasoning in the afterlife. Still, historians argue whether coriander made its way to the Levant on purpose, or if it just followed people around like a clingy herb. It grows fast, spreads wide, and can be used in everything from stews to perfumes to, you guessed it, early aphrodisiacs. Apparently in some places it was considered spicy in more ways than one. You pack up and head out again, leaving behind the low, crackling campfire and joining the trail of dust kicked up by the caravan. The road gets rockier now. Mountains loom on the horizon, jagged, cloud-touched, and a bit moody. The passes here are narrow and twisting, flanked by cliffs that seem to lean in like nosy neighbors. But these are crucial arteries of the ancient world. And if you want saffron, you'll have to climb our saffron. The diva of spices, you don't carry saffron, you cradle it. These thread-like crimson stigmas are plucked by hand from delicate crocus flowers, about 150,000 flowers, to make just 1 kilo. It's pricier than gold by weight, and always has been. In the highlands of Persia and Kashmir, entire villages once bloomed purple for a few short weeks every year. Whole families would fan out at dawn, bent over the fields, fingers stained red by lunchtime. You reach the first of those villages as the sun begins to lower. Here, you're offered a steaming bowl of rice speckled with saffron. The aroma is otherworldly, sweet, floral, faintly metallic. The taste is subtle, but it colors your whole palate. One pinch transforms the dish, one thread, and suddenly it's no longer just food. It's memory, ritual, celebration. A young woman explains that saffron isn't just for eating. It's used in wedding garments, sacred paintings, even eye kohl. Some cultures believed it gave you divine visions. Others just liked the way it made your robes look expensive. You walk through a drying hut filled with trays of crocus threads, laid out like rubies in the golden light. And yes, they're guarded, always have been. Spice fraud ran rampant here. There were cases of dyed silk threads being passed off as saffron, and traders carried special tests to tell the difference. One involves dipping it in water. Fake saffron bleeds fast. Real saffron blooms slowly, like a secret unfurling. Outside, an old man tells you a story while polishing a tarnished silver spice box. According to him, saffron once came from lightning bolts striking a crocus at just the right moment, creating a divine flower too potent for mortals. He chuckles, then shrugs. Still better than the one about Zeus turning someone into a flower, he says. Historians, for their part, aren't much clearer. They still argue whether saffron spread from the Aegean or originated independently in several regions. Genetic evidence points one way, pottery fragments suggest another. It's a botanical mystery worthy of its mystical reputation. You sip warm milk steeped with saffron and honey. It coats your throat like velvet. Around you, children laugh, goats bleat, and an old lute player picks out a tune that sounds vaguely like a lullaby. A chill creeps in with the wind, but you're wrapped in a saffron-dyed shawl now, and it's warmer than expected. Everything here smells like sunlit earth and expensive soup. As stars emerge overhead, one of the saffron pickers shows you how to press the threads between your fingers. "This is the feeling of autumn," she says. "You can carry it in your pocket." You press the strands and the smell is sharp, bitter-sweet, almost coppery. It lingers in your skin. Like most of the spices you've encountered, saffron refuses to leave quietly. Back in the sleeping village, nestled among saffron blossoms and stone houses, you find your place for the night beneath a low ceiling of wooden beams. A cat curls at your feet. Outside, the wind rustles dry petals. You fall asleep with saffron under your tongue and the distant sound of laughter on the mountain. The morning air is sharp and cool, and you rise early, before the sun floods the valley with gold. The village around you is still wrapped in the quiet of morning, and a few saffron pickers are already on their way out to the fields. You pull on your sandals, stretch, and take a long, slow breath. Today you're heading toward a city that has seen more spice routes than you can count. Damascus. The journey is long and the road winds through rough terrain, but the spice market in Damascus awaits, and you're eager to see it. Damascus, as it was once called in ancient times, was a place where trade and culture collided, creating a fusion of flavors that reverberated across empires. As you travel, you notice the changing landscape. From the arid desert mountains to the low, fertile plains near the city, the air carries a different scent, one that's faintly sweet, like figs and dates, but with a spicy undercurrent. The merchant traders who followed you on this journey pass by, each with their own treasures, each a mobile patchwork of the ancient world's flavors. Alongside them, travelers carry bundles of dried fruit, leather goods, and bottles of honeyed wine, but it's the spices they most covet. As the city nears, the smells grow stronger. Saffron, yes, but now also cinnamon, cloves, cumin, and the warm, musty scent of sweet olive oil. Damascus, the cradle of the spice trade, hums with life. The market is a tangled mess of voices, each one calling out their wares in a dance of languages: Arabic, Turkish, Greek, Persian, and more. You're close to something big, a place where centuries of human desire for flavor have transformed simple herbs into the currencies of kings and merchants alike. Walking into the heart of the market feels like stepping into an entirely different world. The stone streets are narrow, lined with brightly colored stalls, and every shopfront holds displays of bags, jars, and baskets filled with spices so vibrant they almost seem to pulse with energy. Traders shout over each other, attempting to draw your attention to their prized goods. A man with a thick beard waves his hands in excitement, urging you toward a stall piled high with dried lavender, while another offers to sell you pouches of frankincense, a favored incense in the Roman Empire, often associated with religious rituals. Frankincense, the prized resin of the boswellia tree, is one of the first spices to leave a trail in the history books. It was used by ancient Egyptians for embalming, by the Greeks in sacred rites, and by Romans to perfume their homes. Historians debate its exact origins. Was it native to Arabia, or did it come from distant lands in the Horn of Africa? There's still uncertainty about how ancient cultures discovered it. But what's clear is that it was considered sacred by just about every ancient culture that encountered it. To them, it wasn't just spice, it was a gift of the gods. You pause by a stall where a vendor sprinkles crushed frankincense onto glowing embers in a small metal brazier, releasing the sweet, smoky fragrance into the morning air. There's something soothing about the scent, something almost divine. As the smoke rises, you wonder about the ancient rituals that surrounded frankincense, about those first traders who braved vast deserts to bring it from distant lands, about the people who believed in its power to purify souls and keep evil at bay. Just beyond the frankincense, a young girl is selling bundles of dried thyme, mint, and marjoram, herbs that were once believed to be protective against evil spirits. The Egyptians loved their mint, using it in both cooking and medicine, and the Greeks and Romans used it in their baths. Mint, in particular, has always had a curious relationship with people. It's cooling, invigorating, and calming all at once. A perfect companion for those who want to wake up without a jolt, without the sting of caffeine, and of course thyme. A spice that traveled from the ancient Mediterranean to become a household staple across Europe, thyme wasn't just for flavoring your roast. It was once considered an antidote for poison, and people believed it gave them courage before going to battle. You pick up a small bundle of mint and inhale deeply. There's something soothing about its sharpness, something grounding about how it clears your mind. You slip it into your bag. Maybe it'll help on the long trek ahead when you'll need to stay alert, but also remain calm. The morning passes quickly, as Damascus does to those who come in search of spices. The city is a maze of narrow streets and towering minarets, and the sun begins to climb higher as you make your way through. The market here, vibrant and chaotic, has been the heart of the region's spice trade for centuries, and you can't help but marvel at how timeless the exchange of goods, stories, and scents feels. As you step away from the market and wander through the ancient city, you realize the full breadth of what these spices have meant throughout history. They've made their way through the hands of kings and queens, emperors and emperors' wives, across oceans and deserts, through palaces and kitchens alike. They've been soldiers in the greatest wars, and the secret ingredients in feasts that have fed entire civilizations. They've been traded like currency, battled over like land, and loved like old friends. And yet, here you are, standing in a modern Damascus market, with spices that have been cherished for thousands of years right at your fingertips. Tomorrow, you'll journey toward the Mediterranean coast, where the spice trail continues. But tonight, you sit back and enjoy the fruits of centuries of labor, tasting the subtle complexities that these tiny, dried pieces of the earth bring to the table. You take a deep breath of the crisp Damascus air and feel connected to something ancient, something that has passed through the fingers of countless others, spices that have defined and shaped civilizations. The sun dips lower as you begin your journey west, toward the Mediterranean, and with it the world of spices begins to shift yet again. The air changes, carrying the salty scent of the sea. You walk along the narrow, well-worn roads that lead to the coastal city of Tyre, once a great Phoenician port, and now a quiet city that still hums with the weight of history. The ancient Phoenicians were the undisputed masters of the sea. They built the first true trade networks, stretching all the way from the eastern Mediterranean to the far reaches of Britain, their ships laden with luxuries that no one could resist: wine, glassware, textiles, and, of course, spices. They had access to some of the finest goods the ancient world had to offer, and they were eager to trade. The scent of these spices must have filled their ships, winding around their ankles like the ocean breeze, calling them to faraway lands. You arrive in Tyre as the city starts to wake up from its afternoon siesta, the sunlight casting golden streaks over the ancient ruins. As you stroll through the marketplace, the scents of fresh seafood and herbs drift past you, and for a moment you can almost imagine the bustling port of Tyre at its height. Ancient Phoenician ships would have docked here, their decks piled high with goods, waiting to be sold to the highest bidder. The spice traders who worked the docks must have moved with an elegance born from centuries of experience, knowing exactly how much pepper, myrrh, and cinnamon could be loaded onto each ship, ensuring that nothing was wasted. The Phoenicians were especially known for their luxurious purple dye, made from the murex snail. This was an empire built on trading luxury, but it was their spice trade that was perhaps their most enduring legacy. Spices, along with their famous purple textiles, were worth their weight in silver. They controlled much of the trade route that carried cinnamon and cloves, imported from India and Southeast Asia, to the heart of the Mediterranean. Their merchants knew every corner of the spice world, and it was in cities like Tyre that the world's first spice conglomerates were born. As you walk, you pass a stall displaying vibrant bunches of oregano and basil. These herbs were popular in the ancient world, not just for their culinary uses, but also for their medicinal properties. In ancient Egypt, oregano was used as a remedy for coughs and colds. You can almost imagine a market stall in Alexandria, perhaps selling dried oregano in neat bundles, the air filled with the scent of fresh herbs and the promise of better health. You take a moment to stop and speak with the vendor. He tells you about the plants that grow on the hillsides nearby, plants that have fed Tyre for centuries. Basil, thyme, mint, they grow wild here, he says, his voice full of pride. He explains that these simple, fragrant herbs are among the oldest cultivated plants in the Mediterranean, cherished not only for their flavor, but also for their medicinal properties. Historians still debate the exact origins of many Mediterranean herbs. Did they spread from Egypt to Greece, or were they always native to the region? The evidence is unclear, but it's certain that herbs like oregano, basil, and thyme were integral to both ancient cuisine and medicine. There are stories of ancient Roman cooks using oregano to season their meats, while Greek healers would use it to make poultices to treat various ailments. The blend of culinary and medicinal uses is what made these herbs so special. As you wander through the city, you notice a change in the spices being sold. While cinnamon and pepper are still popular, there is a growing demand for something new, saffron. It seems that after centuries of careful cultivation, saffron has made its way west from the Far East, and the Phoenicians are once again at the center of its trade. You find yourself walking past another vendor who offers you a taste, a small spoonful of rice dyed bright yellow with saffron. The rice is delicate and fragrant, with a flavor that is both sweet and floral. It reminds you of the saffron you tasted in the highlands of Persia, but here it feels different, more decadent, more luxurious, as if the Mediterranean has transformed it into something entirely new. You stop to chat with the vendor, an old man who tells you that saffron is so valuable that only the richest citizens of Tyre can afford it. To the Phoenicians, this precious spice was a symbol of wealth and prestige, reserved for the royal courts and the elite of society. But the scent of saffron still lingers in the streets, a reminder that even the poorest of Tyre have tasted its magic, if only for a moment. As the sun sets, you walk toward the edge of the city, where the harbor gleams in the fading light. The ships still come and go, even today, though the spice trade has slowed down considerably. Yet the legacy of Tyre, of the Phoenicians and of the ancient spice routes that connected east to west remains strong. The market here still pulses with the rhythms of history, and the spices still tell their stories, whispered by the sea breeze. Sitting by the shore, you close your eyes and listen to the waves lapping at the rocks. For a moment you can almost hear the echoes of ancient traders, their voices lost to time, but still carried on the wind, mixing with the scent of cinnamon, saffron, and sea salt. You breathe deeply, savoring the air as the world around you begins to quiet, ready for the next step in your journey. As night falls over the Mediterranean, you settle in for a brief rest before continuing your journey. The gentle rhythm of the waves and the occasional cry of seabirds are soothing as you think back to the days of ancient seafarers. You imagine the creak of wooden ships loaded with exotic treasures, fabrics from the far reaches of India, rare gems from Africa, and of course the spices that once ruled the world. These spices were worth more than gold, and many a merchant made a fortune with nothing more than the right blend of scents. You start moving inland again the next morning, the scent of the sea lingering in your hair, and head towards the storied city of Alexandria, where the Mediterranean and the ancient world converge. Alexandria, once the jewel of the Hellenistic world, had long been a place where cultures met, and now you stand at the crossroads of history. In this city, the spice trade took on a new significance, as it became the epicenter of the ancient world's intellectual and economic life. Alexandria was more than just a port city. It was a vibrant hub where the brightest minds and richest traders gathered, and it was here that spices were not only traded, but also transformed into symbols of wealth and prestige. As you enter the Aitzer bustling marketplace, the air is thick with the scent of incense and fresh bread. The streets are crowded with people from every corner of the known world: Greeks, Egyptians, Romans, Jews, Persians, and many others. Some come for the spices, others for the books or the latest technological inventions, but all of them seem to be drawn to this city of knowledge and possibility. The combination of scents is intoxicating, and you find yourself inhaling deeply, wondering if this was how it must have felt for those who came here centuries ago. Among the most prized of Alexandria's commodities was pepper, which came from distant lands like India, wrapped in the tales of far-off places. Peppercorns were so valuable that they were sometimes used as currency. Roman emperors even used pepper as a symbol of their power and prestige, and in many ways it was pepper that helped fuel the empire's hunger for trade routes. Historians still argue over whether the Romans' obsession with pepper was purely for its flavor, or if it also had a more symbolic importance in the context of Roman luxury and power. What is clear is that, as they spread across the empire, pepper became one of the most coveted spices of all. But Alexandria was a city that believed in variety, and the market stalls are filled with all sorts of other exotic spices. Saffron, which had recently made its way westward from the east, is found in abundance. A vendor offers you a small glass jar filled with the vibrant red threads, and you find yourself marveling at how a mere handful of these tiny, delicate strands could be worth a small fortune. Saffron, prized for its color and flavor, is used in both cooking and medicine. In ancient Egypt, it was part of a sacred ritual, an offering to the gods, a symbol of life and rebirth. You think back to your earlier days in the desert, remembering how the spice traders you met spoke of saffron's significance. It wasn't just a spice, it was a symbol of beauty, mystery, and power. As you continue walking, you pass a stall, selling something that catches your eye: dried ginger. The vendor, an elderly woman with a warm smile, offers you a taste, and you quickly realize that ginger, like many spices, has a flavor far more complex than you had imagined. It's spicy, sure, but it's also sweet and woody, a deep warmth that spreads across your tongue. Ginger's origins are debated. Some say it comes from Southeast Asia. Others argue that it could have originated in India. But what's undeniable is how it became a staple in ancient kitchens. Ancient Egyptians used it in their food, and as medicine, and the Greeks and Romans too enjoyed ginger for its health benefits. In fact, ginger's medicinal properties were so revered in ancient times that it was included in almost every herbal remedy. Roman physicians swore by it to treat everything from indigestion to sore throats, and it wasn't just a spice, it was a cure-all. Like many spices of the time, ginger was considered a gift from the gods, something powerful enough to heal and protect. Historians are still unsure exactly when ginger first made its way into the Mediterranean, but it's clear that by the time of the Roman Empire, it was a vital part of the ancient pharmacopoeia. You pause to admire a display of cumin, another spice whose significance stretches back millennia. Cumin was a common ingredient in the kitchens of both the Greeks and Romans, and like many ancient spices, it also held a place in the world of medicine. In ancient Rome, cumin was used as an aphrodisiac, a digestive aid, and even a treatment for bad breath. Historians have long debated whether cumin's medicinal uses were based on superstition or scientific observation, but what is certain is that cumin's long journey from the fields of the Middle East to the markets of Alexandria is a testament to the spice's universal appeal. As you walk deeper into the marketplace, you notice the spices being sold not just for their culinary value, but as part of a larger cultural exchange. Here in Alexandria, people are more than just buyers and sellers. They're also traders of knowledge, ideas, and culture. The spices are part of a greater tapestry woven into the fabric of civilization itself. Eventually, you find yourself standing at the edge of the marketplace, where a grand building rises in the distance, the famous Library of Alexandria. The library, once the largest and most significant of the ancient world, is a testament to the city's intellectual importance. You can almost feel the weight of knowledge in the air. The scent of ink, parchment, and papyrus mixes with the spices of the marketplace, and for a moment, you imagine yourself living in a time when knowledge and spices were intertwined in ways that would define civilizations. You decide to sit for a moment and enjoy the view, watching as the sun sets over the Mediterranean. The warm colors of the sky reflect in the water, and you feel the rhythm of the ancient world slowly fading into the modern one. The spices, the people, the knowledge, they've all left their mark on the world, and now all you can do is breathe in the moment, the spices and the stories they carry. The night draws closer, and with the fading of the sun, Alexandria transforms. The crowds of merchants and scholars slowly give way to a quieter atmosphere. You meander along the cobblestone streets, the faint scent of cumin and saffron still, lingering in the evening air, and you realize that the heart of Alexandria pulses not only in its grand library, but also in its deep connection to the greater Mediterranean world. For all the luxury and intellectual wealth found here, it is also the epicenter for a more subtle exchange, the blending of cultures, of flavors, and of ideas. And it's this melting pot of ancient influences that made the spice trade so much, more than just a commerce of goods. You wander into a small courtyard, and there, tucked away in the shadows, you find a quiet tea house. The aromas wafting from within draw you inside, sweet, herbal, warm. The kind of place where, centuries ago, scholars and traders alike would have gathered to share stories of their travels and trades. You take a seat at a small table, and the waiter, an older man with a kind smile, brings you a cup of warm tea flavored with a blend of spices. He tells you it's a local favorite, a soothing infusion of cinnamon, cloves, and cardamom. You take a sip, and the warmth spreads through you, the spices working their magic with each drop. The flavors are both comforting and exotic, a small taste of the very trade routes you've been following. Tea, as it turns out, was a relatively late arrival to the Mediterranean. It was a beverage that would first take root in China and India, long before it arrived on the shores of Europe. But the act of drinking tea, a ritual that's familiar to you now, was once a new and unfamiliar practice. Historians still debate exactly when tea made its way to the Mediterranean, but what is clear is that, as it did, it was imbued with the same cultural and medicinal significance as many of the spices you've encountered. Early Europeans drank it not just for the pleasure of its flavor, but because they believed it had incredible healing properties. It was thought to cure ailments, improve digestion, and even cure fever. As you sip your tea, the conversation in the tea house continues. Around you, you overhear a few passing remarks about the traders who come through Alexandria, carrying not only tea and spices, but also news from distant lands. You realize how essential the flow of goods was to the exchange of knowledge. The exchange of spices was so much more than a business transaction. It was a means of broadening horizons, of connecting disparate cultures. Spices became part of that conversation, carried in the hands of traders who would have had their own stories to share. Perhaps this is why spices became so deeply embedded in the cultures they touched. They weren't just products. They were experiences, stories, and traditions distilled into tiny, potent packages. Your mind wanders to the broader spice trade, how these same flavors have made their way into nearly every corner of the world. The Roman Empire, of course, was the largest importer of Eastern spices, but it was the Byzantine Empire that would take the Mediterranean trade to new heights. The Byzantines knew the value of spices, and they too became obsessed with the Eastern treasures. But unlike their Roman predecessors, they didn't just value spices for their culinary uses. They believed that spices had a divine, almost magical quality. They would sprinkle cinnamon over their food in the hopes of warding off evil spirits, and the sweet scent of cloves was thought to bring blessings to the home. Interestingly, historians still debate the exact reasons behind the Byzantine obsession with spices. Some argue that it was simply a mark of opulence, a way for the emperors to show off their wealth and sophistication. Others believe that the deep religious significance the Byzantines attached to spices, along with their association with divine favor, helped solidify their importance. What is clear, however, is that the Byzantines understood the value of spices beyond their flavor, recognizing them as something sacred, something to be treated with reverence. This mystique surrounding spices would spread far beyond the Mediterranean, taking root in places like India and China, where spices had already been a part of daily life for centuries. You sit back in your chair, taking in the gentle clink of porcelain cups and the murmurs of conversation. Here, in this tranquil moment, you begin to understand that the story of spices is not just the story of food. It's the story of human connection, of cultures intertwining, of a shared history carried across seas and deserts, one tiny, potent package at a time. As you finish your tea, the waiter brings over a small dish of dried figs, glazed with honey and dusted with cinnamon. You savor the sweetness, the rich, deep flavor of the cinnamon, and reflect on the journey you've been on. You've traveled from the spice-laden ports of India to the bustling streets of Alexandria, and as you eat, you realize that the spices have not only led you across vast lands, but also through time. The history of these spices is, in many ways, the history of civilization itself. You stand up to leave, stretching your legs, and thank the waiter for his hospitality. Stepping back into the warm night air, you can feel the weight of centuries on your shoulders. The spice trade, for all its grandeur and mystery, is also a story of human desire, of the search for something more. More flavor, more power, more connection. And as you head back toward your next destination, you can't help but wonder what the future will bring, and what new stories will unfold in the quiet exchanges of spices yet to come. Word count, 1091. The evening sky deepens, a canvas of stars now flickering above you as you leave the bustle of Alexandria behind. The soft evening breeze carries with it the distant scent of the spice market, still clinging to your clothes, and as you walk through the quiet streets, your mind drifts back to the legacy of the spice traders. The story of the spice trade didn't end with Alexandria. No, it was only just beginning. From here, you start to sense the true depth of its journey, not just in terms of geography, but in the profound effect it had on the development of civilizations. The trail of spices would soon spread far beyond the Mediterranean, reaching into the heart of Europe and even the farthest reaches of the Far East. As you head inland through the Egyptian desert, you imagine the ancient caravan routes that once carried spices along paths that wound across Asia, Africa, and into Europe. These ancient traders who trekked across harsh, unforgiving deserts had to contend not only with nature, but with the threats of thieves, wild animals, and sometimes hostile rulers. Yet their thirst for wealth and desire to share the world's flavors pushed them onward. You can almost feel the heat of the desert on your skin and the dust in the air as you imagine these travelers, their camels laden with treasures of the East, including the spices that were the lifeblood of their trade. But it wasn't just the Middle Eastern merchants who were involved in this great exchange. There were the Indian spice traders, the famed black pepper merchants, whose knowledge of the ancient trade routes and their mastery of navigation allowed them to become integral players in this vast global network. Historians still argue about the exact origins of the spice trade in India, but it's clear that even in ancient times, the subcontinent was an essential part of this world-spanning commerce. Indian traders made their way through treacherous mountain passes, across plains, and even out onto the Indian Ocean, where they connected with merchants from Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. India, with its sprawling subcontinent, was home to a wealth of spices, from the famous black pepper to cardamom, turmeric, and cinnamon. These spices became the backbone of India's influence in the ancient world. Indian traders would bring their precious cargo to the great ports of the Arabian Peninsula, where they would be loaded onto ships bound for distant shores. Their travels helped to establish not only spice trade routes, but also cultural exchanges that would shape the development of civilizations for centuries to come. One particularly fascinating aspect of the Indian spice trade was the role of the Malabar coast, which is often referred to as the spice garden of the world. This coastal region, located in modern-day Kerala, became the center of India's spice trade, and it was here that some of the most valuable spices were cultivated. Malabar's pepper, in particular, was prized above all others, so much so that it became a symbol of wealth and power. The bustling port cities along the coast were filled with merchants who carried the prized peppercorns and other spices to foreign lands, exchanging them for gold, ivory, and other treasures. In fact, the importance of pepper in the ancient world is hard to overstate. It was so valuable that it was often referred to as black gold, and it was traded with such fervor that it helped fuel the rise of powerful empires. The Roman Empire, for example, became obsessed with pepper, and emperors would go to great lengths to secure their supply of this precious spice. There are even accounts of emperors using peppercorns as a form of tribute, or paying for lavish luxuries with it. As you walk through the desert, the distant lights of a caravanserai begin to twinkle in the distance, and you are reminded of the journey of these merchants. The spice trade was not only about commerce, it was about the creation of empires. It's easy to think of the Roman Empire as a dominant force in the ancient world, But the trade of spices, black pepper in particular, was one of the driving factors behind its vast wealth and military prowess. As the Romans expanded their empire, they established trade routes to bring these valuable goods back to their cities, helping to feed the empire's insatiable demand for luxury goods. But the Romans were not the only empire vying for control of the spice trade. The Byzantine Empire, as we've seen, was another major player. And then there were the Chinese who, though not directly involved in the spice trade, played an indirect role by controlling the trade of silk and other luxury goods along the Silk Roads. China's vast reach and influence were critical in shaping the flow of spices from east to west, and the Silk Road itself became one of the most important conduits for this exchange. Through this complex network of trade, spices traveled from one civilization to the next, passing from hand to hand, culture to culture, until they became as indispensable to the West as they were to the East. However, the rise of the spice trade also had its dark side. As you continue your journey, you begin to think of the less glamorous side of the story: the piracy, the violence, the exploitation that occurred along the trade routes. Many traders were forced to deal with the constant threat of bandits who lurked in the shadows of the desert, eager to seize the precious cargo that the merchants carried. And then there were the empires, which sometimes sought to monopolize the spice trade, using their power to suppress competition and ensure their dominance in the global market. Despite these challenges, however, the spice trade continued to thrive, expanding its reach to new territories and influencing the development of civilizations across the world. The very spices that once seemed so distant and exotic now played a role in shaping the destiny of empires and cultures, marking the passage of time with each journey they undertook. As you sit by a flickering campfire, the crackling of the fire, punctuating the silence of the desert night, you find yourself reflecting on the vastness of the spice trade. It was a story of ambition, innovation, and survival, one that connected people from all walks of life, from emperors to common traders. And in many ways, it was a tale of discovery, a discovery of new lands, new flavors, and ultimately, the way these spices would forever change the world. The fire flickers low, casting dancing shadows around you as the desert night cools, and you find yourself drifting back to the spice trade's more adventurous side, pirates and plunder. It's easy to picture a group of merchants, their camels, laden with gold, silk, and spices, making their way through the desert. But what happens when these travelers don't reach their destinations? The journey was perilous, and for many traders, their goods never made it. Instead, their prized spices became the target of ruthless marauders, and it's in these desert sands that a darker side of the spice trade emerges. Piracy along the spice trade routes wasn't just a nuisance, it was a threat that shaped the way empires viewed the protection of their trade routes. The Arabian Desert, the Indian Ocean, and the waters around Southeast Asia became hotbeds for pirates. Some of the most infamous were the Arab and Somali pirates, whose raids on merchant ships carrying valuable goods were legendary. These pirates had their own networks, tracking the merchant vessels and waiting for the opportune moment to strike. The spice-laden ships, once thought to be symbols of immense wealth and power, became easy targets for these pirates, who would descend on them like vultures. Sometimes these pirates would take the goods and leave the crew stranded in the middle of the ocean. Other times, they would hold ships for ransom, knowing that the value of their stolen cargo far outweighed any price. It's strange to think of it now, these modern bustling ports where spices are sold on every corner, with hardly a thought to how those spices got there. But once upon a time, getting your hands on a bag of pepper or a jar of cinnamon meant venturing into dangerous territory, where you had to navigate not only the natural elements, but also those who sought to steal from you. If you were a merchant, traveling from, say, India to the Mediterranean, you had to keep an eye out for pirates as much as you had to keep an eye on your spice stock. But piracy wasn't limited to the desert or the seas. The rise of European colonial powers, with their own interests in the spice trade, only intensified the drama. The Portuguese, for example, were the first Europeans to establish a foothold along the East African coast and into India, securing vital spice ports like Goa. However, Their dominance also meant that other European powers, particularly the Dutch and the British, sought to challenge their monopoly. Historians still debate whether the colonial scramble for the spice trade was driven more by the pursuit of profit or by the thirst for power. On the one hand, the riches of the spice trade were undeniable. Spices were so valuable that they could alter the course of empires. The Dutch, for instance, established the Dutch East India Company, which became one of the wealthiest trading companies in history. It is said that the company controlled nearly all of the spice production in the East Indies by the 17th century. But the cost of this monopoly was steep. Nations waged wars over control of spice islands, with the local populations often caught in the crossfire. These wars were about more than just wealth. They were about influence and domination. The spice trade was a symbol of power, and the control over spice-producing regions became synonymous with controlling global trade itself. The battle for the Spice Islands, particularly the Banda Islands in Indonesia, was fierce, with the Dutch using ruthless tactics to seize control. It's said that when the Dutch arrived in the Banda Islands in the early 1600s, they forced the native population into submission, and in some cases, they enslaved them to work on spice plantations. The Dutch traded a cruel and efficient form of domination for a stranglehold on the spice market. And as the Europeans expanded their influence, they didn't just take the spices, they took the people too. Indigenous workers were often forced into grueling labor conditions, cultivating the very spices that fueled the empire's wealth. This exploitation marked the dark side of the spice trade, one that still resonates in the world's history today. Still, the demand for spices didn't wane. You might be sitting by the fire in the middle of a desert, thinking about pirates and empires. But even as all this was unfolding, spices continued to change hands and new trading routes were forged. From the far-flung islands of the Indian Ocean to the great cities of Europe, spices were carried in carts, ships, and caravans. The spice trade, like so many great exchanges in history, was about survival, and in many ways, it mirrored the human condition itself. Ambition, conquest, and survival all rolled into one. You sit back, the warmth of the fire now almost gone, and think of the local merchants and traders who lived through these chaotic times, the ones who made the long journey across dangerous landscapes, bringing with them a taste of the world beyond. For them, the spice trade was both a way to earn a living and a means of connecting with other cultures. While the pirates fought over control, the merchants fought to keep the flow of spices alive, knowing that with each shipment, they were taking part in something far greater than themselves. In the end, the spice trade was far more than a simple exchange of goods. It was a story of human ingenuity, persistence, and the desire to connect with the world beyond. The spices, once considered exotic luxuries, became the currency of a global economy, connecting people from every corner of the earth in ways no one could have predicted. As you rise from your seat by the fire and stretch your legs, the cool, desert breeze caressing your face, you realize how far this journey of spices has taken you, across centuries, cultures, and continents. And in the end, it was not just the spice itself that changed the world. It was the people who exchanged it, the stories they told, and the legacy they left behind. As the dawn begins to break, the first rays of light painting the desert in soft hues of gold and pink, your thoughts shift toward the culmination of this vast, sweeping trade, the endgame of the spice route, where wealth, culture, and conquest came together. After all the years of perilous journeys, piracy, and battles, where did it all lead? The spice trade, once the domain of secretive, exclusive routes across oceans and deserts, would soon become the engine of the modern world. It wasn't just about spices anymore. It was about empires, dominance, and the drive for expansion. The Four, Portuguese who had once ruled the seas in search of a spice-rich empire, would see their control slip away as the Dutch and British seized the opportunity to carve out their own empires in the East. But how did they do it? The Portuguese were the first Europeans to arrive in India in the late 15th century, and their monopoly on the spice trade was nearly unchallenged. Yet, they didn't account for the ever-shifting tides of power. It wasn't just the allure of spices that attracted the Dutch and British to the East. It was the power of the sea and the opportunity to reshape the world in their image. In the 17th century, the Dutch East India Company made its move, establishing its own vast trading empire across Southeast Asia. It wasn't merely the spices that mattered. The Dutch sought control of key strategic ports and islands, turning the spice trade into a well-oiled machine of colonial domination. Historians still argue about the true cost of this empire building, but one thing is clear. The Dutch didn't simply trade. They built their own world, and spices were at the very heart of it. The British, of course, were never far behind. The British East India Company, founded in 1600, would eventually eclipse the Dutch in both wealth and influence. By the 18th century, they had established a foothold not only in India, but across vast swaths of Asia and Africa. The British Empire's obsession with controlling the spice trade didn't just drive economic expansion. It shaped the politics of entire continents. But what about the people who lived in these regions? How did their lives change when the spice trade collided with the forces of European imperialism? The local populations who had once traded spices freely with neighboring cultures suddenly found themselves swept up in a new kind of exchange. Historians often debate whether the arrival of the Europeans brought greater prosperity to these regions, or whether it simply led to exploitation, disease, and the destruction of local cultures. Take the case of the Banda Islands, the spice islands of Indonesia. These tiny islands, once home to small self-sufficient communities, were transformed by the demand for nutmeg and mace. The Dutch, seeking to corner the nutmeg market, carried out a brutal campaign in the early 1600s to control the islands. They massacred most of the indigenous population, enslaved those who survived, and essentially turned the Banda Islands into a spice plantation for their empire. Nutmeg, once grown only on a handful of islands in the world, became a cornerstone of Dutch colonial wealth and a symbol of the violent legacy of the spice trade. And yet, even in the face of such violence and colonial control, the spice trade flourished. The same spices that had once been traded by caravans and small ships now flowed in massive quantities through the ports of Europe. The spices, black pepper, cloves, cinnamon, and the elusive nutmeg, became everyday commodities in European kitchens used to flavor food, preserve meat, and even ward off disease. But they were also symbols of status, luxury, and power. A spice-laden dish was no longer just food, it was a statement. You pause, your mind drifting through the centuries, thinking about what it must have been like to live through these times, to witness the dramatic transformation of the world through the trade of something so simple, so small as a spice. And yet, these tiny, humble commodities, peppercorns, cloves, cinnamon sticks, changed the very course of history. They defined the rise and fall of empires, shifted the balance of power, and reshaped cultures across the globe. What's even more fascinating is how the spice trade wasn't just a trade in goods, it was a trade in ideas. As spices traveled from the east to the west, they carried with them knowledge, innovations, and cultural exchanges. The people who brought spices to the far corners of the world didn't just bring their goods. They brought their stories, their beliefs, and their technologies. The introduction of spices like cinnamon and cloves to the Western world, for instance, wasn't just about flavoring food, it was about changing diets, revolutionizing medicine, and influencing global cuisine. Even today, the spices that once seemed so exotic and distant are integral to our daily lives. From the pepper shaker on your dinner table to the cinnamon stick in your mulled wine, these once precious commodities have become so commonplace that we hardly think about their journey. But in this quiet moment, by the fire, with the desert, night settling around you, you realize how much of the world's history is embedded in the spices that have traveled across time and space. The spice trade is not just a chapter in the history books, it's a living, breathing part of our world today. Its legacy is woven into the very fabric of modern life, its flavors, its stories, its power. You've traveled far in your mind tonight, across seas and deserts, through bustling marketplaces and imperial courts. And as the desert winds whisper softly in the distance, you realize that the journey of spices has been your journey too. The desert still rests peacefully outside, but you're no longer thinking about just spices. Your mind is wandering deeper into the broader world that the spice trade built. It's hard to grasp, but somewhere between the crusades for control of spice islands and the lavish banquets served to monarchs, something remarkable happened. An entirely new global economy emerged. The spice trade didn't just enrich individual merchants or governments, it transformed the way people across the world interacted, traded, and viewed the world itself. It changed the way people thought about luxury, about value, and about the very idea of trade. Before the spice trade, the world was fragmented. Local trade systems ruled, and most people never ventured far from the villages where they were born. But once spices became a currency, once they moved across continents, the boundaries of the world began to blur. It's almost poetic, isn't it? A few bags of cinnamon could shape cities, entire economies, and the destinies of entire nations. A simple pinch of saffron in a dish could make the difference between affluence and obscurity. Now think about the size of these trading networks, the routes that crisscrossed through Arabia into Persia, down through India, across the Indian Ocean, and up into Southeast Asia. All of these paths were once lively, bustling hubs of trade. There were huge markets in places like Damascus, Cairo, and Baghdad, where traders from every corner of the world gathered to buy and sell goods, exchange ideas, and share stories. These cities became the meeting places of civilizations, where East truly met West. One of the more surprising results of this massive influx of goods was that it led to the creation of entirely new professions. Merchants, of course, but also middlemen, shipbuilders, and even international bankers. People needed to finance the enormous voyages required to transport spices, so banking and investment strategies were developed in response. In fact, this, trade and the subsequent growth of global commerce, were one of the driving forces behind the rise of modern banking systems in Europe. And as merchants carried spices westward, they didn't just transport goods, they transported knowledge. Spices themselves were valuable for their medicinal uses. You might be surprised to learn that one of the main drivers of the European obsession with spices wasn't necessarily their use in food, but their supposed healing properties. For example, pepper was believed to cure everything from indigestion to the plague. The arrival of cinnamon in Europe was believed to be a powerful remedy for digestive issues, and even as a treatment for fevers. In the medieval period, there was a kind of medicinal mystique surrounding spices. People believed these exotic substances could protect them from all sorts of ailments, which led to a whole new field of medical thinking. But the introduction of these ideas wasn't one-sided. As much as Europe absorbed the medicinal wisdom of the East was not untouched by the scientific developments coming out of the West. The exchange of goods led to the exchange of knowledge, philosophy, and even the very way people thought about health and wellness. Chinese, Persian, and Indian herbalists began to blend their knowledge with Western ideas, creating a cross-cultural dialogue that would last for centuries. However, for all the romanticism that comes with the idea of this golden age of exploration, we must acknowledge that the spice trade wasn't all idyllic exchanges of wisdom and wealth. For one, it was a profoundly unequal trade. The arrival of Europeans in Southeast Asia and Africa meant the imposition of colonial rule, and the extraction of resources was not only a commercial venture, it was a violent one. Entire societies were remade, disrupted, and even destroyed. As European powers carved up the spice-rich regions of the world, the Portuguese, Dutch, and British were not merely interested in a fair trade, they were interested in control, in domination. Take the case of the nutmeg trade. By the late 1600s, the Dutch had established a complete monopoly on the spice, particularly on the islands of Banda in Indonesia, where nutmeg was grown. The local people were forced to grow nutmeg for the Dutch, and if they attempted to sell it to anyone else, they faced brutal consequences. This kind of monopoly, enforced through violence, wasn't just about nutmeg. It was about the power to control resources and to shape the world's economies in a way that served the imperial powers. In the Western world, however, the focus was different. Spices were sought after for their use in food and medicine, and as more of these exotic products entered the European market, they became symbols of wealth and sophistication. The Renaissance courts in Europe, for example, were obsessed with creating opulent feasts for their aristocrats, and spices were at the heart of these extravagant displays. A banquet with an abundance of spices was a way of flaunting one's status. If you were a noble in Renaissance Italy, the more spices you had at your disposal, the more prestigious you seemed. This cultural obsession with spice would continue through the centuries, influencing everything from art and literature to the very design of royal palaces. And that's not even touching on the birth of new culinary traditions, such as those seen in Italian, French, and Spanish cuisine. The introduction of spices like black pepper, saffron, and cinnamon completely transformed Western cooking. Recipes that once would have been bland by today's standards became rich, aromatic, and exotic. The use of spices didn't just make food tastier, it opened up entirely new dimensions of flavor. In a way, the spice trade helped shape the way we think about food today, paving the way for a global culinary culture. By now, your thoughts are no longer on the hot desert winds, but on the intricate dance of trade, politics, and human ambition that came together to create the modern world. It's astounding to think that something as small and humble as a grain of pepper could leave such a lasting impact, don't you think? The last embers of the fire flicker out, and you feel the weight of history pressing down on you, yet oddly enough, it's not overwhelming. In fact, it's almost comforting. This realization that the spice trade was not just an exchange of goods, but of ideas, cultures, and even entire ways of life. You close your eyes, and in your mind's eye, you see it all. The merchants, the spices, the sea voyages, the empires. It's as if the world itself was rearranged by the shifting of a single spice-laden ship on the horizon. With the rise of European imperialism, the spice trade did not just fill the coffers of distant kings and merchants, it profoundly reshaped the very notion of what it meant to be wealthy or elite. Wealth was no longer just land or gold. Now wealth was a matter of access, the ability to purchase or acquire rare goods from distant parts of the world. A single peppercorn could make a statement about your status, your global reach, your taste. And as European aristocrats dined on lavish feasts, the demand for spices only grew. But what did this mean for the broader population, the peasants and laborers who were far removed from the golden halls of palaces? For them, spices were a symbol of something different. In the context of medieval and early modern Europe, spices were considered luxury items, reserved for the wealthy elite. But over time, the very presence of these exotic commodities began to change the landscape of European society. A modest cook, with access to a pinch of pepper or a few grains of saffron, could elevate their meal to something considered exotic and sophisticated. It's curious, isn't it? Something so small and simple could shift how people viewed food and, by extension, themselves. Historians still debate the significance of spices in the daily lives of peasants, though one thing is certain, spices were tied to the evolving identity of European cuisine. Early medieval European cooking was based on what we might now call bland or rudimentary ingredients, root vegetables, grains, meats, and simple herbs. But as spices from the East trickled into Europe, they quickly became symbols of wealth and opulence, even if only small amounts were used in everyday cooking. Yet the process of incorporating these spices into daily life wasn't without friction. As more spices entered Europe, they were often met with suspicion. People wondered where these unfamiliar ingredients came from and what their true purpose was. Was it just about flavor, or did they have magical or medicinal properties? In fact, during the medieval period, spices were sometimes linked to superstition and even considered to have mystical powers. The notion that spices could cure ailments was not solely rooted in practical medical knowledge. They were seen as a kind of antidote to the vagaries of life itself. You may have heard that cinnamon was said to have the power to ward off evil spirits, or that clove could cure toothaches. It's fascinating to think about how the spice trade wove together so many different strands of human history. On the one hand, it was about commerce and conquest, about ships sailing across dangerous waters with treasure in tow. But on the other, it was about the seemingly mundane, about the little ways in which people's lives were touched by the far-off worlds that their ancestors had never dreamed of. And when we consider the role of women in the spice trade, a different story emerges. As with many other industries, the spice trade was dominated by male adventurers, captains and merchants. Yet, the women in Europe and Asia who wielded influence in other more subtle ways, such as in the kitchens, also played their part in the culinary revolution that spices instigated. In Renaissance Europe, for example, women were often the ones who prepared the lavish feasts for the aristocracy, the ones who combined these precious spices with fresh ingredients to create intricate dishes. They didn't just wield power in the form of wealth. They wielded it in the very flavors that graced royal tables. In the East, too, women had a significant role in the spice trade, though often in ways that were not as outwardly visible. Take the women of the Indonesian spice islands, for example, who, while largely kept out of the public sphere, were still deeply involved in the production and trade of spices. As the Dutch and Portuguese expanded their presence in Southeast Asia, many of these women worked behind the scenes, maintaining the delicate balance of local trade networks that were crucial to the spice trade's success. In some cases, they even served as intermediaries between the locals and the European powers, negotiating trade deals and keeping the economy flowing. Of course, not every impact of the spice trade was positive. While some cultures flourished under the trade, others were irrevocably changed or even destroyed. Think of the indigenous cultures of the Caribbean, which found their societies dismantled by European powers eager to control sugar, spices, and other crops. The spice trade often went hand in hand with the Atlantic slave trade, as European colonizers brought enslaved Africans to work on plantations in the Caribbean and South America. Historians still argue whether the benefits of the spice trade were enough to justify the human toll it took, and the answer is, of course, complicated. Still, the legacy of the spice trade cannot be denied. It reshaped the world in ways that extend beyond the kitchen table or the gilded palaces of Europe. It set the stage for the globalization of commerce, the rise of modern empires, and the establishment of world-spanning trading networks that continue to influence our lives today. You feel the weight of it now, this vast unseen network that reaches across time and space, connecting people who would otherwise never have known one another. You realize that even now, in the foods you eat, the books you read, and the languages you speak, you're still living in the shadow of that spice-laden trade. And while the spice trade itself may have faded, its effects linger, subtly influencing how we live, what we eat, and how we view the world. The roads that once carried nutmeg and cinnamon now carry everything else: ideas, technologies, goods, and people. And as you reflect on this long journey, it's not lost on you that the history of spices is more than just the history of a commodity. It's a history of connections, of people, cultures, and entire worlds intertwined by something as small and simple as a peppercorn. The world is shifting around you, but it feels remarkably gentle as you reflect on the lasting effects of the spice trade. Once a purely economic exchange, it began to shape every layer of society, from the rulers who dictated trade routes to the everyday lives of ordinary people who never saw a ship, but nevertheless felt the ripples of the waves crashing into their kitchens. The power of these small, fragrant commodities, their mere presence, stretched far beyond the dinner table or the banquet hall. As the spice trade matured, it expanded into an entirely different sphere: culture. While the rich dined lavishly, people across the globe began incorporating spices into daily rituals that evolved with time, blending the mystical, the medicinal, and the social. Take, for instance, the cultural practice of tea drinking in China. Historically, tea was sometimes infused with spices, and this aromatic drink became not just a beverage but a means of cultural expression, particularly in the imperial courts of China and Japan. The introduction of tea to Europe had its own dramatic effects, particularly in England, where it would spark the rise of the famous afternoon tea ritual. At its core, though, it was more than just about taste. Tea was another luxury, an item of status, and for centuries, the English obsession with tea wasn't only about the beverage, it was about the experience of serving it, presenting it, and savoring it. This was, in many ways, a reflection of how spices had already woven their way into the fabric of European society. But the spice trade wasn't just about food or drink. It was also about luxury goods, perfume, and cosmetics. In 17th century France, for example, the French court became enamored with the use of spices in perfumes, especially cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. It was believed that these scents could purify the air, protect against illness, and most importantly, mask the rather less than pleasant odors that might accompany life in the crowded, disease-ridden cities. Perfumed gloves, scented soaps, and fragrant oils became the height of sophistication. Here again the spice trade had its footprint, small, almost invisible, yet undeniably impactful. This cultural shift isn't something that happened overnight, of course. The spread of spices was gradual, and their place in society didn't always come easily. The rise of coffee houses in the 17th century, which became intellectual hubs in places like London and Paris, exemplifies the marriage of commerce and culture. Coffee and chocolate were prized commodities that traveled from the New World, with spices often accompanying them. These coffee houses were more than just places to grab a drink. They were spaces where people discussed politics, philosophy, and science. Ideas were brewed alongside beverages, all facilitated by the very products that emerged from the global spice trade. In addition to elevating the social classes who could afford such luxuries, spices also played a key role in establishing the colonial framework that would dominate much of the world for the next few centuries. The colonization of parts of Africa, Asia, and the Americas by European powers was driven in large part by the pursuit of lucrative spice trade routes. The Dutch, Portuguese, and Spanish were among the most ambitious explorers, and their voyages were as much about economic domination as they were about scientific discovery. For many of these European colonizers, spices were not only valuable as goods, but as tools of power. Control over spice-producing regions was one of the key objectives. In the era of European imperialism, the brutal conflicts that ensued between competing European powers for control over the Spice Islands, particularly in Indonesia, are a stark reminder of how deeply entwined wealth, power, and violence were during this period. Yet beyond the battles and the bloodshed, there were moments of collaboration, of peaceful trade, and of shared knowledge. The port cities where Europeans and Asians mingled became places of cultural exchange, where languages, arts, and technologies merged. The spice trade, while certainly a catalyst for imperialism and exploitation, also acted as a bridge between distant worlds. Traders, regardless of their nationality, shared techniques, knowledge, and even recipes. Spices became one of the earliest conduits for a kind of early globalization. Even today, we see this lingering impact in our food, culture, and commerce. The world has shrunk so much that a spice from the island of Java, for instance, is now a common ingredient in kitchens from New York to Mumbai. But it's also important to remember that the globalized world we now live in didn't just emerge out of thin air. It was carefully built, step by step, by traders, explorers, and merchants. And in their pursuit of cloves, nutmeg, and pepper, they wove the fabric of the world we know today. But even as you reflect on these profound effects, there's an undeniable sense of melancholy that accompanies the knowledge of what was lost. The world of the spice trade was not a utopia, nor was it a period of peaceful coexistence. The rich, the powerful, and the colonizers reaped most of the benefits, while the indigenous peoples of the spice-rich regions paid a steep price for the privilege of others' luxury. Whether it was through forced labor or the erasure of entire cultures, the darker side of the spice trade is a reminder of the true cost of empire building. As your mind wanders through the spice-laden history, you feel a slow shift in the air, like the calm after a storm has passed. The high seas, the tumultuous battles, the exotic marketplaces, they all begin to fade away, leaving you with the quieter moments. The sound of clinking spices in jars, the flicker of candlelight reflecting on the faces of traders, the warm comfort of food made with the same spices that have shaped the world. These moments are softer, more peaceful, and in many ways, it's these subtle remnants of the spice trade that have lingered the longest. As the world around you fades into the warm embrace of sleep, the legacy of the spice trade lingers, woven into the very fabric of human history. You drift through centuries, images flashing like delicate wisps in your mind, ships carrying spices, across dangerous oceans, intricate markets in Istanbul, merchants bargaining over cloves and pepper, all wrapped in the quiet hum of human ambition and desire. But let's pause for a moment to consider the most curious aspect of the spice trade. Despite the vast wealth and global impact it had, spices themselves have remained remarkably simple. What was it about these small, unassuming ingredients, fragrant, often pungent, that caused such upheaval in the course of human events? Why did something as elemental as a spice spark wars, trade routes, and cultural revolutions? You can almost picture a single peppercorn, small and black, sitting in your palm, quietly telling its own story. It's a reminder that sometimes the smallest things have the power to shape history. In many ways, the spice trade mirrors human nature itself. We have this undeniable urge to explore, to seek out the unknown, to want what we can't have. And in those years when spices were more precious than gold, this desire led people to risk life and limb for a glimpse of something exotic, something rare, something that promised a taste of the world beyond their own borders. But just as the centuries of spice-fueled trade shaped the modern world, they also left behind legacies that persist to this day. The patterns of colonialism, exploitation, and global trade are still being felt in contemporary politics, economies, and cultures. The history of the spice trade is far from a fairy tale of simple commerce. It's a tale of power, greed, survival, and resilience. And within it, there are stories of people who, for all their struggles and hardships, created beauty from the simplest of ingredients. There's a sense of quiet beauty in the understanding that the spice trade was as much about connections as it was about commerce. It wasn't just about acquiring wealth. It was about connecting people. For every merchant and sailor who made their way across vast oceans, there was someone in a distant corner of the world, tasting a new flavor, learning something new, and finding their own way in the complex web of human experience. Now, as you ease further into the world of dreams, you're reminded that the legacy of the spice trade is not just contained in the jars in your kitchen cupboard, nor in the textbooks of history. It's in the very essence of how we live, how we connect, and how we interact with the world around us. The gentle sway of cultures, ideas, and flavors across time has created a patchwork of history that continues to unfold. In a sense, the journey of these spices mirrors your own. You're here, drifting along on a quiet tide of time, moving from one historical moment to the next, much like the merchants once did, seeking connections, maybe not on the high seas, but in the very act of understanding. The spices, after all, are just the beginning. Beneath them lie the stories of human lives, relationships, and the push for a better, richer, more connected world. And as you begin to slip deeper into slumber, your thoughts shift from the bustling ports and lavish feasts to something quieter. The hum of the world around you fades into the background, and you are left with the soft, comforting thought that the journey of the spices is a never-ending one. Each grain, each flavor, each tiny moment of exchange lives on in the stories we continue to tell, the meals we share, and the way we interact with the world. There's no rush now, no urgency, just the quiet presence of a long history that will continue to unfold in gentle waves of connection, one small spice at a time. As you begin to slip deeper into the haze of sleep, let's take one last moment to consider how the spice trade, so often a symbol of riches and power, also contained moments of simplicity and human warmth. You've journeyed through centuries of global trade, of great empires rising and falling over the quest for pepper, cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg. And yet, in all this grandeur, there's something soothing in the knowledge that the humble spice trade started with simple human curiosity, a curiosity to explore, to taste, to share. In the quietest corners of history, away from the lavish courts and bustling ports, there were people cooking with these spices. They weren't grand nobles or powerful merchants, but ordinary cooks and families who, in small kitchens or outdoor markets, discovered the joy of adding a pinch of cinnamon to a bowl of soup or a sprinkle of cumin to a roast. What started as an expensive luxury became a part of the daily life of people from all walks of life, bringing warmth, comfort, and a sense of connection to a world that, at times, felt far too vast and divided. You've probably noticed that spices aren't just about flavor, they're about tradition. The way cinnamon is used in a cozy winter dessert, or how saffron is added to a pot of paella. These small acts are more than just about food. They're about preserving the knowledge and cultures of those who first brought these spices to the world. It's a reminder that, even though the spice trade itself is a thing of the past, the impact it had on daily life continues, woven into the fabric of our meals, our relationships, and our memories. Now, as you settle further into the quiet comfort of sleep, you might imagine yourself standing in one of those bustling spice markets, the air filled with the rich, heady scents of cloves and cardamom, saffron and pepper. You feel the weight of history around you, yet it's not overwhelming. It's comforting, almost like a familiar old song. The trade that began with the journey of these tiny, fragrant seeds has woven the world together, creating connections across time and space. And as you rest, you realize that the ripple effect of this trade still touches you today, in ways both small and significant. The world might seem big, and your place in it small, but in this moment, everything feels interconnected. The spices, the merchants, the cooks, they're all here in your thoughts, in your dreams, and just as they once crossed oceans and cultures, so too do the stories of their trade cross your mind, bringing with them a sense of peace and continuity. With each passing moment, the world of spices fades gently into the background as you relax into the soft, rhythmic pulse of the universe. There's no need to rush, no need to chase after anything. You're at rest, carried along on a quiet journey, one that's been unfolding for centuries and will continue long after you drift into deeper sleep. And as you let go of the day, the legacy of the spice trade, its flavors, its stories, its impact on the world, will remain with you. It's a soft, lingering memory, like the warmth of a cup of tea infused with a hint of cinnamon, or the aroma of dinner simmering gently on the stove. Now, with the faintest of smiles, you give yourself over to the night. The world of spices, with all its stories and flavors, will wait patiently for another time. But for now, rest, relax, and let sleep carry you forward.